Muy buenos días a todos los que nos acompañan en nuestros soportes digitales del Colegio de México esta mañana, este 16 de mayo, para discutir un poco la aparición del libro Gestión de interdependencias en sistemas federales, consejos intergubernamentales y creación de políticas públicas, de Johanna Schnabel, que fue editado en 2020 por Freie en inglés y en 2022 traducido y publicado en español por la Universidad Autónoma del Estado de México. Para esta discusión tenemos la fortuna de contar con la autora, con Johanna Schnabel, quien desde Berlín estará compartiéndonos algunos puntos fuertes de esta publicación, de este colosal trabajo que ha dado pie al libro, y estarán discutiendo el libro también los profesores Adi Carrera, a quien me da mucho gusto que esté con nosotros y a quien presentaré bien en su momento, y el doctor Joel Mendoza, en un segundo tiempo también hará los comentarios sobre su lectura de esta publicación. Después tendremos una sesión en la cual, escucharemos las reacciones de la autora a los comentarios y tomaremos de los asistentes presenciales aquí en esta sala del Colegio de México, o bien por las plataformas del colegio, los comentarios y preguntas que vayan apareciendo. Antes de presentar a la profesora Johanna Schnabel, simplemente le quisiera recordar la dinámica. Johanna, as we talked yesterday, we will speak in Spanish, but your presentation and the first part of this discussion will be developed in English. And the final part of the discussion, in the final part, we will take some comments and questions, and you could answer in English, and we will try to translate if it's necessary. So I will introduce you in Spanish, sorry, and after that I will let you the microphone. La profesora Johanna Schnabel labora como profesora justamente en la Cátedra de Política Alemana del Instituto Otto de Ciencias Políticas en la Universidad Libre de Berlín. Tiene un doctorado en Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad de Lausana, Suiza, y fue investigadora postdoctoral en la Universidad de Köln, en el Reino Unido. Es experta en federalismo y relaciones intergubernamentales, y como todos sabemos es la autora de este libro, Gestión de interdependencias de sistemas federales, consejos intergubernamentales y creación de políticas públicas, que fue, ya lo mencionaba, publicado originalmente en inglés y ahora traducido al español. Y también la profesora Schnabel, ha sido publicada en importantes revistas especializadas en estos temas, como Publius, The Journal of Federalism, Regional and Federal Studies, West European Politics, y en la revista Governance, entre otros. Johanna, gracias por aceptar esta mañana estar en esta discusión sobre tu libro, y por favor.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen so you can actually see my presentation. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this event and to give me the opportunity to present my book. I wrote the book in English, of course, and I'm very, very pleased that it has now been translated into Spanish to make it accessible to a wider readership, and countries, to be honest, I know very little about when it comes to their federal system. So that has also been, thanks to Joel, been an opportunity for me to learn more about those countries. But of course, today I'll talk about the countries that I know best. So in my book, I examined two separate but related questions. The first question is, why can the euro and de facto interdependencies of governments in a federation be a problem for federalism and for the operation of the federal system? And related to that, what are intergovernmental councils and how do they contribute to managing those interdependencies? So how do they solve the problems that might be related to the independence of governments in a federation? So I'll address those two questions in my presentation today to develop the argument, to present the argument of the book, and I'll then apply it to two examples. One is a national education standards in Germany, so policy reform that took place a few years ago, and the introduction of a national curriculum in Australia. So to understand the argument of the book, we first need to take a step back and think about what federalism is about. We know that the United States is a federation. My own country, Germany, is a federation, Switzerland is a federation, and as I've learned now, Mexico is a federation as well. But what does that actually mean? What is federalism about? Federalism is about the autonomy and about constitutionally entrenched autonomy. And this means that a federation consists of two orders of government, a federal government and constituent units that both have autonomy, and this autonomy cannot be withdrawn unilaterally from the other order of government. So this means that each order of government has its own powers. This in principle means that the two orders of government could act independently from each other, but there are several interdependencies built in the system or that have developed as the practice of how these federal countries operate. So focusing on the euro interdependence, what we find in most federal systems is that there is a range of concurrent or shared powers, so powers where both, or areas in which both orders of government operate, where they make policy decisions that then have implications on the responsibilities of the other orders of government. What we also see in many and increasingly in many federations is a so-called functional division of powers. That's a situation where the federal government passes legislation, but this legislation is implemented by the constituent units. So Germany would be the prime example of a federation that has this kind of division of powers. Because the constituent units implement federal legislation, they have to coordinate with the federal government. The federal government needs to coordinate with them to make this work. So those are interdependencies built in the federal system. However, what also emerged increasingly is so-called de facto interdependence. So these are policy problems that cut across the different powers assigned to two orders of government. So for instance, imagine a situation where the constituent units are responsible for education, but the federal government is responsible for economic policy. So if we look at unemployment policy, let's say there is a policy problem that needs to be solved, such as high unemployment. This concerns both education policy and economic policy, so two powers that are assigned to the two orders of government, and then mean that these two orders of government need to work together. There are also de facto interdependencies because of externalities or consequences of decisions that are made by one government on the other government. And finally, something I guess that sounds very familiar to Mexicans, the often very strong fiscal dependence of the constituent units on the federal government that also create mutual dependencies between the two orders of government. So while federalism is built on the idea of autonomy, in reality, the two orders of government are very closely interlinked, and their actions have consequences for the other order of government. Now, what this means when we think about the stability and the operation of the federal system, it means that we have situations where individual policy making, so unilateral decisions by one order of government or by one government, whether it's the federal government or the constituent units, has implications on the other orders of government in such a way that it might actually undermine their autonomy. If this is the case, federalism is at risk. And there are three ways that I identify in the book through which this kind of what I call disruptive unilateralism can happen, and through which the behavior of an order of one government can impinge on the autonomy of the other governments. The first type is individual policy solutions. For instance, in Canada, the federal government decided about 20 years ago to create the so-called Millennium Fellowship Fund that provided fellowships to students, even though higher education and student funding is a power of the provinces who operate universities and so on. This created a whole range of problems for the provinces, but it was a decision of the federal government that it took completely on its own without even consulting the provinces. Nevertheless, they had to bear the consequences. As a second type of disruptive unilateralism, we have the imposition of policy solutions. This is an example, or is an instance where the two orders of government work together, decide on a policy, but then the federal government essentially imposes this policy on the constituent units. So they agree on something, but very often the federal government uses fiscal incentives or other leverage on the constituent units to make them accept a policy that it has developed on its own and that might often not meet the priorities or preferences of the constituent units. And then finally, the third type of unilateralism that I identify is the non-compliance of policy solutions. So here we also have a joint solution that the two orders of government agree on, but a government might not comply with this policy solution. So these are three types in which the behavior of one government can undermine the autonomy of the other governments. I usually like to depict this situation as by reference to an HBO TV show, Game of Thrones, where there's a very powerful king sitting on the Iron Throne, which you can see here. And I use this image because most of the time what happens is that while in principle, both the federal government and the constituent units can engage in this type of unilateral behavior, it's often the federal government that adopts individual policy solutions, imposes policy solutions on the constituent units, and fails to comply with policy solution that both orders of government have agreed upon. So this means that federal government is the main threat to the autonomy of the constituent units. Again, I think this is something that sounds very familiar to observers of Mexican politics. As I said, the two orders of government are very strongly interdependent to each other. What developed as a consequence of that, and this is the focus of the research project through which my book has been translated into Spanish, so-called intergovernmental relations have developed in most federal systems. Intergovernmental relations is a bit of an unfortunate term because it can have a very broad meaning, but in federal studies is usually used to mean the structures and mechanisms through which a government of a federation interact to coordinate policymaking. Intergovernmental relations can either consist of legislative mechanisms. The most prominent one is second chamber, so the role of the Senate or whatever it is called, through which legislation can be coordinated between the two orders of government, federal government legislation. And there are executive mechanisms. Those are actually the more important ones that encompass a range of mechanisms, and especially intergovernmental councils, which is what the focus of my book is about, and which is what I'm focusing on in this presentation. Intergovernmental relations, and especially intergovernmental councils, can, on the one hand, lead to better outcomes through policy making, through the coordination of policy making, and they can protect the autonomy of governments. So if you remember the types of disruptive unilateralism that I presented that undermine the autonomy of governments, that these types of unilateralism can be prevented through intergovernmental councils. And that's the main argument of my book. So to give you an idea of what intergovernmental councils are, I'm showing two pictures here. One is of the first ministers' meeting in Canada. So that's a conference that occurs every once in a while, or a meeting of the federal prime minister and the provincial premiers to discuss all kinds of policy issues. Spain has so-called Conferencia de Presidentes, which is a very similar type of council. The prime minister meets with the presidents of the autonomous communities. Those are the typical kind of peak councils that are most visible, most prominent in most federations. But this is not to ignore that there's a range of other types of councils, often concerning sectoral policy. So there's a council in health, care, education, agriculture, and so on, to discuss policy issues that concern these policy areas. And those are the different types of council that I'm focusing on, that I examined in the book. Here you can see an overview of the council structure in Australia, which focuses or concentrates around the National Cabinet. National Cabinet is not a cabinet, it's an intergovernmental council. And as you can see here, is supported by a range of committees and other advisory groups that feed into the National Cabinet. But alongside, as you can see on the right side here, there's a range of ministers' meetings, so focusing on the areas that I just mentioned: education, energy, environment, health, and so on. So this is what we're talking about here in this presentation. So as I said, intergovernmental relations in general, intergovernmental councils in particular, can foster efficiency, effectiveness, and equity of public policy making. By exchanging information, governments can promote the efficiency of policy making. By pooling of resources, they can as well enhance the efficiency of policy making. So for instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic, governments in many federations pool resources to buy medical equipment at a cheaper price, just to make purchases more efficient, and the provision of this equipment more efficient. By mitigating negative externalities, governments can promote the effectiveness of public policy by harmonizing the implementation of federal legislation, or by establishing national standards through coordination. Intergovernmental councils can promote equity if they encourage governments to cooperate. But my book does not focus on these aspects. My book is interested in the extent to which intergovernmental councils can protect the autonomy of governments. So as a reminder, intergovernmental councils are the most formal mechanism of intergovernmental relations, focusing on our executive mechanisms, and can encompass a range of different types of council. Generalist councils that are prime ministers, and policy-specific sectoral councils that focus on a specific policy area. And we have another important distinction to make between vertical and horizontal councils, whereby vertical councils are those that include the federal government, and horizontal councils are those that don't include the federal government, so are just councils of the constituent units. Now, remember that I said earlier on that unilateralism is the great threat to constituent unit autonomy, and intergovernmental councils can protect autonomy by encouraging governments to reach what I call collaborative joint solutions. So those are policies that are jointly adopted by all governments, not unilaterally adopted, that are not imposed by the federal government on the constituent units, and with which all governments comply. And now the question is, how do intergovernmental councils reach such collaborative joint solution? How do intergovernmental councils avoid that governments adopt policy unilaterally? And what I found in my book is that there are conditions that need to be fulfilled for intergovernmental councils to effectively protect government's autonomy. And those 4 criteria all relate to the institutional design of the government council and their operation. The first one is that intergovernmental councils have to include contested policy matters on their agenda. In a federation, governments might be reluctant to coordinate because it means giving up some degree of autonomy. If you coordinate, if you work together with others, you cannot do everything you want the way you want it. You need to compromise. And governments might be reluctant to do that. So intergovernmental councils must be designed in such a way that they will process such contested policy matters. which means politicians must meet in person instead of sending staff on their behalf, and agreements must be made at council meetings rather than through exchange of letters or similar mechanisms. As a second criteria, intergovernmental council must be highly institutionalized. They must have a secretariat. They must meet frequently, and they must have committees that support their operation, because this ensures that coordination is ongoing, it's steady, and it addresses all the relevant issues. And this high level of institutionalization usually leads to a situation where governments first decide that they want to address a policy problem together, they define the objectives, and then they discuss the details in further meetings. As a third criterion, intergovernmental councils must adopt politically binding resolutions. It's very rare that intergovernmental councils adopt legally binding agreements, but they must, in the resolutions they pass, in the outputs they produce, there must be some kind of political commitment to actually follow through on what they decided. And final, but probably the most important aspect that makes intergovernmental councils able to protect government's autonomy is that they must not be dominated by the federal government. Councils are dominated by the federal government, which means that the federal government chairs the meetings and provides a secretariat, are usually under the influence of the federal government, and usually allow the federal government to actually engage in the type of unilateral behavior that I have described earlier. So it's very important that the federal government does not permanently chair a council and does not provide its secretariat. So it's one participant amongst others and not the leading one. As I said, those are features that relate to the operation of intergovernmental councils themselves, which is not to ignore that there are a range of factors that you can see here that further help intergovernmental councils protect government's autonomy. One is external pressure, often coming from international supranational organizations that push governments to coordinate, even if they might be reluctant to do so. Overlapping policy ideas also facilitate the work of intergovernmental councils, because they usually mean, and the same applies to the party system, if you have congruent parties in government, this usually means that governments have an idea of what they want to do. They have, in a way, policy objectives have been defined through ideas within parties, which makes it easier to work together. An important fact is participation of constituent units in federal decision-making. This weakens the dominance of the federal government in councils that are dominated by the federal government, while the federal spending power, so the ability, the authority of the federal government to interfere in areas of constituent unit jurisdiction by offering money, either strengthens the dominance of the federal government councils that are dominated by the federal government, or means that a council is dominated by the federal government, even when the federal government does not provide the council chair or the council secretariat. So these are also contextual factors that need to be taken into account. Now, after having presented the argument in more theoretical terms, I would like to apply it to two examples, as I mentioned earlier. The first example is from my own country and concerns the introduction of national education standards. In Germany, education is an exclusive power of the Länder, which are Germany's states or provinces, if you want. And what we had when in the early 2000s, and those actually still exist, were very strong interdependencies among the Länder, even though they are responsible for education policy. And these interdependencies mainly exist because the PISA study, which is an OECD assessment of student performance, showed there were very strong regional differences in educational performance among the Länder, which is something the German population does not accept. We also have high citizen mobility, so families move from one land to the others, and then their children need to go from a school from one land in another school, which can in a different land, which can sometimes cause quite some problems if the differences in education policy between the Länder are too significant. And finally, there's a very strong threat of the federal government to intervene in education policy if the Länder were not able to show that German education policy would work well. And this led to the Länder to decide that they would introduce national education standards. And this mainly happened through the so-called Standing Conference of Ministers of Education. So that's a council of the land ministers of education, does not include the federal government, which is very important to know here. And though in principle, this conference does not process very contested matters, usually Länder cooperate if they really want to cooperate. If anything is salient, they might refrain from coordination, which has happened in the past. However, very strong external pressure from the OECD coming through Germany's very bad performance in the PISA study and shared ideas about what education policy should look like, compensated this lack of capacity, and then actually led to the Länder adopt these national education standards. The very strong level of institutionalization of the Standing Conference of Ministers of Education further facilitated coordination and the collaboration among the Länder. And we could see this very nicely because after it was decided that national education standards should be developed, which happened at a meeting of this conference, committees of the conference consulted with experts and prepared draft standards that were then reviewed by the ministers, and at further meetings were adopted by the ministers of education of the Länder. And as I said earlier, the federal government is not a member of this conference. So although the Länder, the federal government put some pressure on the Länder to improve education policy, could not coerce them into accepting those national education standards. So national education standards in Germany are a collaborative joint policy solution to which all the Länder agreed, that was not imposed on them by any order of government, especially not the federal government. The situation was very different in Australia, where the PISA study also showed that education policy was not as good as Australians were thinking. Like in Germany, in Australia, education policy is an exclusive authority of the Australian states. The federal government does not have powers on primary and secondary education. We also have very strong de facto interdependencies, again, because of citizen mobility, but also because in Australia, education policy has been defined very, very strongly in terms of human capital and as a core factor of economic performance, economic policy being a responsibility of the federal government. So here we have very strong horizontal interdependencies between the states, but also between the states and the federal government. And so at some point in the early 2000s, the federal government came up with the idea of introducing a national curriculum across the whole country. And this curriculum was mainly developed by the Education Council, but also had to pass the Council of Australian Governments, which is the peak council, the meeting of the Prime Minister and the state premiers. And this process was very much dominated by the federal government that dominates the Council of Australian Governments, which, by the way, now is called National Cabinet. And the federal government did not only use its dominance of that council, it also used its spending power to coerce the states into accepting a national curriculum, even though the states did not want to have a national curriculum. They just wanted to have a harmonized state curriculum. So the Australian curriculum is a federally imposed policy solution, very much shaped by unilateral decisions of the federal government that the states just had to buy because they received money in exchange. Nevertheless, the Education Council is very strongly institutionalized, has a long tradition of the states working together and working with the federal government. And this made this whole process a bit less disruptive because the federal government is still sensitive to some preferences and ideas of the states and try to accommodate them, even though the overall curriculum was imposed on them. So now to conclude, intergovernmental relations and intergovernmental councils in particular are a key aspect of the operation of federal systems and can help protect government's autonomy. This means that if successful, they can counterbalance the centralization experience in many federations and, as far as I understand, experience in Mexico as well. Nevertheless, the dominance of the federal government is a major issue. The federal government dominates most vertical councils in most federations. And this means, as a consequence, to make intergovernmental councils work better to protect federalism, it is important to strengthen the constituent unit's voice and influence. This can be done by increasing the level of institutionalization of intergovernmental councils and by strengthening horizontal councils, so councils in which only the constituent units participate. And I want to finish with 5 recommendations that are based on my insights on intergovernmental councils. Recommendation number 1 would be to establish a rotating chair and an independent secretariat. This reduces the federal government's dominance of intergovernmental councils. Recommendation 1 is to make sure that there are frequent meetings, that councils don't meet ad hoc, but that there's a regular schedules and meetings occur on a frequent basis. Recommendation number 3 is to strengthen horizontal coordination, so to make sure that the constituent units can work and do work together, and that they can formulate joint positions to increase their leverage vis-a-vis the federal government. Recommendation number 4 is to create working groups, which increases the level of institutionalization of intergovernmental councils and makes sure that interactions are ongoing, that proposals are reviewed, are discussed, are refined, the experts are included, so that intergovernmental coordination is not just an ad hoc exercise, but is steady and ongoing. And finally, recommendation number 5 is to have different types of councils, so councils in which the federal government participates, councils in which it doesn't participate, and councils that cover different kinds of policy areas. Now, these recommendations are based on my own work on mainly Australia, Canada, Germany, Switzerland, and Switzerland, to some extent the US and Belgium. As I said earlier, I'm definitely not an expert on Latin American federations, and so rather than claiming anything, I would just like to present the question as to what extent these recommendations might be relevant to Mexico, what might be possible obstacles or challenges to implement them. Can they even be implemented, and would they actually serve Mexican federalism? I cannot offer an answer to this question. I hope that the 2 discussants might, or that maybe future research will offer an answer to those questions. For now, I would like to thank you for your attention. I look forward to any comments or questions that you may have.
Thank you, Johanna. Thank you very much for your interesting and very efficient presentation. We will back to you later to listen your answer, your reaction to the comments and questions. And I will switch to Spanish to continue with the discussion. Ahora, bueno, voy a permitirme presentar a la primera de nuestros comentaristas, de quienes están aquí para discutir los temas de este libro. En primer término vamos a escuchar a la doctora Carrera. Ella es profesora de la Facultad de Ciencia, Política y Gobierno de la UPAEP en Puebla. Es doctora en Política Pública con estudios de maestría en Gestión Económica Pública, ambos en la Universidad de Birmingham, en el Reino Unido. Es también licenciada en Administración Pública. Se ha desempeñado como investigadora en varios centros de estudio. Menciono 2 de ellos, el Centro de Investigación de Ciencias Económicas y el Colegio Mexiquense. Y sus temas de investigación, entre otros, debo señalar, son el federalismo, las ordenanzas municipales, y la evaluación de políticas públicas, recientemente con especial énfasis o interés en la Agenda 2030 y especialmente en gobiernos subnacionales. Ella es miembro del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores. Gracias, Ari.
Al contrario, muchas gracias, Johanna. Hi, how are you doing? Congratulations on your talk. It was a very good summary of this really giant work that you have done. Ahora voy a hablar en español para nuestra audiencia que está en español. Muy agradecida, muy honrada con la organización del Colegio de México de poder comentar sobre esta obra que desde que, como ya lo ha comentado el doctor Vicente Ugalde, revitaliza los estudios sobre relaciones intergubernamentales, ¿no? Y aquí también quiero agradecer, por supuesto, al trabajo incansable, siempre sin desfallecer, del doctor Joel Mendoza Ruiz, que fue el que empujó esta idea, buscó los recursos y que ha encontrado mucho apoyo por parte del doctor Vicente Ugalde y del doctor Eduardo Green en la Fundación Getúlio Vargas en Brasil. O sea, sin esta triada de personas, pues no tendríamos al día de hoy esta obra aquí. Entonces, aquí yo me gustaría enfocar mis comentarios más allá de las aportaciones metodológicas que sin duda se pueden extraer del libro, precisamente en el último punto sobre el que hablaba la profesora Schnabel, ¿no? Este análisis tan riguroso de los consejos intergubernamentales, ¿qué enseñanzas o qué cosa podemos nosotros retomar para reflexionar sobre la situación que tenemos en países de la región latinoamericana y del Caribe, y en qué medida realmente podemos pensar que estas recomendaciones que acabas de sintetizar muy bien pudieran sernos de utilidad para buscar esquemas diferentes de coordinación intergubernamental, ¿no? Entonces, para poner un poquito en contexto esto, yo quisiera señalar, para aquellos que pueden estar escuchando estos comentarios, que en el mundo hay casi 200 países que están reconocidos, ¿no? Casi todos son miembros de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas. De esos casi 200 países, entre 25 y 29 son federaciones. Y digo entre 25 y 29 porque depende de a quién le pregunten, ¿no? Si preguntas aquí en América Latina, algunas personas te diremos, por ejemplo, que consideramos que Venezuela es una dictadura y que desde hace muchos años no puede ser considerada bajo ninguna circunstancia como una federación, ¿no? Y entonces por eso digamos que el número de federaciones puede variar. Pero tenemos, son pocos países, digamos una cuarta parte, por así decirlo, o máximo menos de una cuarta parte, es un porcentaje muy pequeño en relación con los países del mundo. Sin embargo, son países muy grandes, no solamente importantes en términos económicos, políticos, culturales. Son países tan grandes como la India, como Estados Unidos, ¿no? Por no mencionar, bueno, todos los países europeos que hay, y por supuesto los latinoamericanos, ¿no? Brasil, México. Entonces, esto significa que aunque solamente hay entre 25 y 29 federaciones en el mundo, pues ellos agrupan más o menos al 43% de la población mundial. Entonces, estamos hablando de pues algo que se acerca casi la mitad de la población del mundo, ¿no? Entonces, esto es por una parte el aspecto formal de qué países legalmente, constitucionalmente se asumen como federaciones, pero por otra parte tenemos aquellos que están federalizados, ¿no? En una lógica que se va a reflejar precisamente en lo que tú analizas. Y por eso se comprende que tú incluyas a España en el estudio que realizas, que a mí me parece importantísimo, porque desde el punto de vista, por decirlo, del derecho, España no es una federación, ¿no? Es un Estado unitario. Sin embargo, la forma de operación de su política pública y de sus mecanismos, precisamente de toma de decisiones entre ámbitos o esferas de gobierno, es sumamente federal, ¿no? Es lo más federal que tenemos en la región de Iberoamérica, ¿no? Entonces, hay varios países que están federalizados o en el proceso de avanzar hacia la federalización, ¿no? Tú comentas, bueno, normalmente hay dos niveles de gobierno, ámbitos de gobierno. Sí, en la mayoría de los países, me gustaría resaltar los casos de Brasil y de Sudáfrica, donde los gobiernos municipales están reconocidos como una tercera instancia de gobierno, y eso precisamente les va a dar un peso muy importante en estos mecanismos de coordinación intergubernamental. ser reconocidos como parte de la federación, ¿no? Cosa que no ocurre en la mayor parte de los otros países. Ahora, esta idea de la federación o federalización de países va a ser todavía más relevante a partir de la década de los 80, por varios motivos, ¿no? Es una década turbulenta, se da una crisis económica importante a nivel mundial, pero también estamos hablando de la tercera ola de democratización, ¿no? Es decir, que muchos países que veníamos de dictaduras duras o blandas, empezamos a transitar hacia regímenes con características más democráticas. Y al mismo tiempo, en el background, tenemos un proceso económico muy fuerte, ¿no? De pauperización, del aumento de la inequidad en nuestras sociedades, y pues de ahí que la CEPAL le llama la década perdida, la década de los 80. Y esto tiene implicaciones también en la forma de hacer política pública y en incluso en el perfil que van a tener los tomadores de decisiones. ¿A qué nos referimos? Es esa transición entre el enfoque tradicional de la Public Administration, weberiana, ¿no? De Max Weber, hacia un nuevo modelo que es el New Public Management, ¿no? Es una, digamos, una revisión del modelo al que se le van a añadir cosas distintas y que llegaron para quedarse. Entonces es una década muy importante y en este marco se da el proceso de descentralización de la mayor parte de los países de la región. Esto porque es importante para el tema que abordamos, porque en este proceso de descentralización, los gobiernos subnacionales, regionales y locales van a recibir nuevas atribuciones, responsabilidades en materia de prestación de servicios públicos, responsabilidades en términos de descentralización política. Va a haber una elección democrática de autoridades locales, por ejemplo, cosa que, o sea, al principio de la década de los 80 eran 3 o 4 países de la región los que elegían de manera democrática a sus gobiernos locales. Al finalizar la década de los 90 ya tenemos que prácticamente todos los países ya lo hacen a través de procesos democráticos. Y esto implica que darles espacio de poder y toma de decisión. Y empezar a diseñar y trabajar precisamente en estos mecanismos que tú describes, ¿no? Como consejos intergubernamentales que van a tomar, en los que se aspira a que pues todos los actores pues tengan una convivencia colaborativa y tomen decisiones que pues, repercutan para el mejoramiento de los países en general, ¿no? Esto a su vez se cruza también, y creo que esto no se debe perder de vista, con los conceptos de desarrollo que se vuelven la idea principal a finales del siglo XX. Es esta idea del desarrollo humano, esta idea de que se requiere una coordinación no solamente al interior de los países, sino a nivel mundial, y que debe haber una agenda global en torno a los principales problemas públicos que enfrenta la humanidad, ¿no? Y que empezó con la Declaración del Milenio y que ahora tenemos en la Agenda 2030. Ahora la pregunta es, ¿con qué herramientas, con qué antecedentes nuestros países transitan por esos procesos? ¿Y cuáles van a ser los resultados en términos del diseño de estos mecanismos de coordinación intergubernamental, ¿no? Y aquí me gustaría referirme a algo que Bill Bright enfatiza mucho, que es la historia, ¿no? Que si lo vemos desde el neoinstitucionalismo económico, le llamamos el path dependence, ¿no? Es decir, no puedes olvidarte de dónde vienes porque eso va a marcar lo que eres al día de hoy, ¿no? Entonces, cuando tú nos hablas y analizas los consejos intergubernamentales europeos, pues bueno, más o menos tenemos una idea del contexto histórico en el que surge, ¿no? La necesidad de aglutinar estados nacientes, como fue el caso de Alemania, ¿no? De provincias que tenían altos niveles de libertad, de toma de decisiones, y que por lo tanto el arreglo que buscan tiene que ser atractivo para que estos miembros de la federación decidan permanecer, ¿no? Con un alto nivel de toma de decisiones. Pero cuando vamos al contexto de América Latina y el Caribe, pues nosotros tenemos una historia de centralización. somos países centralistas históricamente, por naturaleza, hasta el día de hoy, ¿no? Y este antecedente histórico va a ser fundamental para explicarnos cómo han evolucionado nuestros consejos intergubernamentales. Que si uno hiciera un estudio, que yo creo que eso es una agenda que se lo dejo aquí a los doctores, a Vicente y a Joel, ¿no? Si uno hace un estudio de la composición, cómo funcionan, los resultados que tienen en la región, vamos a ver que precisamente son la antítesis de lo que tú nos propones, ¿no? O sea, hay un marcado predominio del gobierno nacional, es siempre la imposición de políticas públicas top-down, ¿no? Es decir, los gobiernos subnacionales solamente ejecutan, no hay espacios para que realmente los gobiernos subnacionales pues tengan capacidad de decisión en prácticamente ninguna política pública, ¿no? Eso es lo cierto. Ahora, ¿en qué medida podemos nosotros pensar en evolución? Aquí tenemos una circunstancia también que va a emerger pues desde hace ya más de una década, a finales de la primera década del siglo actual, se da una crisis económica importante, ¿no? Que inicia en los mercados inmobiliarios de Estados Unidos y que va a barrer a todo el mundo y en el que se ve involucrado absolutamente todos los países. Y se convierte en la crisis económica más fuerte que había tenido el mundo hasta antes de lo que tenemos ahora derivado del COVID. Cuando ocurren estas circunstancias, en economía hay una cosa que se le llama el efecto crisis. Y esto que implica que cuando hay una crisis económica, política, social, los gobiernos nacionales tienden a recentralizar. Y entonces, en todo el mundo, en absolutamente todo el mundo, hemos documentado precisamente estos procesos de recentralización. Y al día de hoy, pues lo seguimos viendo en todos los países de la región de América Latina, pero hay una paradoja, porque al mismo tiempo que está este proceso latente de recentralización, que en el caso de todos los países de la región es bastante evidente, también existe una necesidad de tener arreglos más federalistas para resolver los principales problemas. No hay ningún problema de los más importantes que enfrente la humanidad que se pueda resolver por un solo país o por un solo gobierno. Entonces necesitamos desesperadamente estructuras que permitan ese trabajo colaborativo, ¿no? Y que más allá de ideologías de que yo quiero ser federal, realmente el federalismo, como tú bien dices y señalas en tu libro muy atinadamente, el federalismo es algo vivo, que se utiliza para muchos propósitos, desde mantener integrado a un país con grandes diferencias culturales, pero también mantener un país fuerte, económica, competitivo a nivel internacional. En el caso de países como el nuestro, necesitamos un federalismo que tenga capacidades de atender los problemas de desarrollo que tiene la mitad de la población, ¿no? Nuestros problemas son muy graves y si no tenemos un esquema descentralizado que funcione adecuadamente, simple y sencillamente no los vamos a poder resolver. Esto, por supuesto, atraviesa por las circunstancias políticas de cuál es el perfil de los tomadores de decisiones. Y al día de hoy la región, al igual que muchas otras partes del mundo, atraviesa pues por una ola de populismo, ¿no? Tanto de derecha como de izquierda. Y este enfoque de gobierno no toma decisiones con base en evidencia, ¿no? Es una cosa ideológica. Entonces tenemos como muy fuertes presiones en sentido de necesidades, de lo que se necesita en nuestros países, pero también tenemos contracorrientes en términos de quiénes son los tomadores de decisiones. Y es en ese medio donde nosotros tenemos que buscar soluciones para que estos consejos que tú atinadamente señalas como un mecanismo para darle vitalidad y que funcione y sobrevive el esquema federal, se necesita, ¿no? El reto es muy grande, eso se lo dejo a la investigación de aquí de los colegas, y yo pues con eso doy por terminado mis comentarios. Les agradezco mucho.
Gracias, Abby. Muchas gracias por comentarios voy a preguntar a Johanna si desea reaccionar a estos comentarios o prefiere que escuchemos los comentarios de Joel.
Maybe I can take the opportunity to clarify a few points that I didn't mention in my presentation, but that Adi very correctly pointed out. And I'll try to keep it short in order not to give another presentation. But I think what you raised a very important point about the specific context in which intergovernmental councils evolve and operate, or in which federalism evolves. And of course, that is different from country to country. And Germany has a very different situation than Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, or any other country in the world, right? But I think what is very important to keep in mind is that federalism, as much as intergovernmental cooperation, are things that evolve over time and that need time to be established, and need time to work, and these practices need to be timed, need time to operate. This being said, there's also no automatism. It's not by establishing a council that a council will develop into a well-functioning council. So there are many other aspects that matter. And I think one aspect is, and that's in a way a bit of a circular argument, because on the one hand, intergovernmental councils, if they work well, can create a proper partnership in a federation. At the same time, to work well, they also require a proper partnership of the federation. And you mentioned Spain earlier, and it's a big discussion whether Spain is a federation or not. My understanding of Spain is that it exactly lacks this proper partnership between the central government and the autonomous communities. And you can see the difference to Germany or Canada, where it's very clear that the country is made of the federal government and the provinces or the Länder, and they are partners. And sometimes, of course, they have conflict. Sometimes, or the federal government can dominate policy making. It can coerce the constituent unions into doing something. But the general understanding is that they are partners. And for me, for federalism to actually work to deliver on its purpose, the two orders of government must be partners. Whatever that means specifically, something that a country, of course, needs to define for itself. But this principle is very important. It's against this backdrop that I think this very, very strong centralization, re-centralization in Latin American federations is a problem. But you also mentioned the relationship between federalism and intergovernmental relations and democracy. Again, that's a very, very important topic. I just wanted to say on this that in this regard, intergovernmental councils can on the one hand help a political system to deliver, so they can help increase what Easton would call the output legitimacy of a political system. On the other hand, intergovernmental councils often meet behind closed doors. They lack transparency, and this can actually also undermine democracy, because very important decisions can be discussed at intergovernmental council. They're not, of course, intergovernmental councils don't adopt laws, parliaments do, but very often parliaments are confronted with a pre-made decision at the intergovernmental council that they cannot influence, and media often don't know what is negotiated at intergovernmental meetings, and even as researchers we don't have access to this. So in this regard, intergovernmental councils can be a problem. And I'll stop with this and look very forward to Joel's comments.
Gracias, Johanna. Gracias. Entonces, bueno, vamos a continuar con el segundo de nuestros comentaristas. Después de estas aclaraciones que empiezan también ya a marcar algunos puntos que pueden ser retomados más tarde. Joel Mendoza es profesor investigador de la Universidad Autónoma del Estado de México, es doctor en Ciencias Políticas y Sociales y especialista en el estudio de las relaciones intergubernamentales, los gobiernos subnacionales y la gobernanza multinivel. Él encabeza el proyecto de investigación Relaciones Intergubernamentales en las Federaciones Latinoamericanas, Salvaguardas Federativas, Derecho Constitucional y Cooperación Internacional, que con el apoyo del CONACYT ha hecho posible una serie de actividades, entre las que se pueden mencionar la traducción y publicación de este libro, pero también una serie de trabajos que aglutinan a investigadores de Brasil, Argentina, México y, bueno, y Alemania para discutir estos temas de las relaciones intergubernamentales. Joel, muchas gracias y bueno, pues, adelante.
Muchas gracias al doctor Vicente Ugalde. Pues, me siento muy contento y agradezco pues la oportunidad de estar aquí presentando el libro, porque vamos, yo soy egresado de la UNAM y esta institución quedaba del camino de casa a la UNAM, de tal manera que yo, aparte de ser admirador de Vicente y de Adi Carrera, me hice admirador también de esta institución y me hice amigo de la biblioteca. Entonces era muy importante entregar este libro que está aquí el día de hoy a la biblioteca. Yo he traído algunos libros y creo que es de las bibliotecas más importantes del país, ¿sí? Entonces era importante que este libro, específicamente este libro, estuviera en esta biblioteca. Este libro, aparte del gusto de presentarlo, pues también tenemos ciertos claros y oscuros en el contexto nacional, porque el pasado 8 de mayo en México se aprobó la Ley de Humanidades, Ciencias y Tecnologías. Esta ley tiene un capítulo sobre relaciones intergubernamentales. Hasta donde yo sé, es la primera vez que una ley tiene un capítulo sobre relaciones intergubernamentales. Y no es un capítulo, pues nada halagüeño. En primera, la ley extingue a la Conferencia Nacional de Ciencia y Tecnología. Esto es, el Consejo Intergubernamental de Ciencia y Tecnología dejó de existir con esta ley y en su lugar las relaciones intergubernamentales se ven instrumentadas únicamente por medio de convenios. Entonces, en todo caso, los convenios son convenios bilaterales, ¿sí? En el desglose que hace Johanna, los consejos, las relaciones pueden ser desde bilaterales hasta multilaterales, verticales y horizontales. Esa riqueza se pierde de una ley a otra, ¿sí? Y únicamente pasamos entonces a acuerdos intergubernamentales que da paso a lo que llamamos bilateralismo adaptado. Es decir, la relación únicamente del gobierno nacional con gobiernos subnacionales que son previamente seleccionados y que pudieran establecer un acuerdo previo sobre las lógicas que tenga la investigación científica en cada una de las entidades. Nos llamaron a una serie de foros para dar nuestra opinión, pues yo me manifesté en contra de que desapareciera esta Conferencia Nacional de Ciencia y Tecnología y que no se manejara únicamente por medio de acuerdos intergubernamentales. Los acuerdos intergubernamentales y los consejos tienen historia en México, ¿sí? El primer consejo intergubernamental fue un congreso de educación, siempre he comentado que es similar a lo que se hacía en Alemania, tal vez replicado pues del caso alemán. Empezó el 1 de diciembre de 1889 y se prolongó hasta el 31 de marzo de 1890. Hubo una segunda oportunidad de que se diera este congreso, que fue entre 1890 y 1891. Ellos discutieron, los representantes subnacionales, una agenda que propuso el gobierno nacional y llegaron a resoluciones que fueron aplicadas no por un acuerdo, ¿sí?, sino por la convicción propia de cada una de las entidades federativas de que la política fuera uniforme en todo el país. Pues empezaron a haber escuelas normales, empezaron a construirse escuelas de educación básica, parvularios, que era la educación preescolar, y también la educación preparatoria. El siguiente capítulo sí tiene que ver con los acuerdos intergubernamentales en México, con los acuerdos intergubernamentales sobre educación, que empiezan en la década de los 20, ¿sí?, para construir escuelas a través de la recientemente fundada Secretaría de Educación Pública, para crear los sistemas integrados de salud en cada uno de los estados, en donde participaban funcionarios nacionales y subnacionales, y lo más importante fue para construir la red carretera nacional. Se fundaban juntas estatales de caminos, y el gobierno nacional transfería el 50% de los recursos de cada proyecto para que se fuera conformando toda la red carretera nacional, que concluyó aproximadamente en los años 60 cuando curiosamente empieza en México el esquema de las carreteras de cuota. Entonces, los consejos intergubernamentales y los acuerdos intergubernamentales son los dos instrumentos de las relaciones intergubernamentales que más han existido en la historia del sistema federal mexicano. Entonces, quisiéramos hacer énfasis en los consejos, toda vez que estamos en la tendencia contraria, es decir, en la desaparición de estos consejos. Y en el caso de este libro, lo que a mí me llama la atención es que empieza con un fuerte énfasis metodológico. Vicente, Eduardo Green y un servidor aportamos el estudio introductorio, es lo que se acostumbra a hacer aquí en México cuando se traduce al español un libro. Entonces, más allá de los aspectos teóricos, enfatizamos los aspectos metodológicos en función de los marcos contextuales, ¿sí? Las capacidades estatales, la función de la política, los temas y cuestiones fiscales, y el más importante para este caso, las estructuras, los procesos y los actores públicos. Las 6 dimensiones de indicadores, ¿sí?, establecen una medición exacta de cuáles serían los consejos. Coincidimos con muchos en el funcionamiento. La coordinación, por ejemplo, se establece en 3 gradas. La vinculación, desde el punto de vista instrumental y desde la medición de la propia interacción de los actores. La institucionalización tal vez es el que más se le dio énfasis a través de aquella ponencia en un congreso canadiense del año 2015, y esta institucionalización es donde podríamos nosotros empezar a marcar las diferencias que tiene el funcionamiento de los consejos intergubernamentales mexicanos. Establece aquí la permanencia, la independencia de la secretaría. Es decir, que el presidente no defina quién es el secretario, sino que el secretario tenga la libertad de establecer una agenda. Aquí en México pocas veces sucede esa condición, ¿no? Que exista un estatuto, que exista comisiones. La cultura política aquí en México en ocasiones va en sentido contrario. Es muy conocido que los legisladores en muchas ocasiones dicen, bueno, si no quieres que se resuelva algo, pues crea una comisión. Entonces el trabajo de las comisiones a veces no es el mejor de los trabajos para poder avanzar, sino es una forma de ir postergando el trabajo, de que el trabajo no salga. Ahí tal vez tenemos diferencias culturales más o menos importantes. Las ideas creo que también coincidimos, ¿sí? Que haya tal vez la intervención de los partidos, la agenda internacional que ya hizo alusión a Carrera, y la participación moderada del gobierno federal. El dominio federal ya lo explicó Carrera de manera amplia, ¿sí? Aquí en México somos distintos. En el caso mexicano de los últimos tiempos, tal vez pudiéramos abonar un poco en que el gobierno nacional ha sido el mejor promotor del funcionamiento federal, en contradicción de los que han hecho los gobernadores en la propia Conferencia Nacional de Gobernadores. Entonces, el dominio federal quedó interrumpido, por ejemplo, en el periodo de Vicente Fox, que fue una persona que descentralizó el gasto. Del 2000 al 2006 empezó a descentralizarse el gasto. Las entidades gastaban más que el gobierno federal mismo. Y en el periodo de Enrique Peña, que se empieza a descentralizar la discusión de la agenda internacional, ¿sí? Sobre todo con la cuestión de la protección a los niños, niñas y adolescentes, que se da precisamente en ese periodo y al interior de la CONAGO. Finalmente, el procesamiento de los problemas públicos es donde yo veo la necesidad, tal vez, de seguir dialogando para poder establecer una mayor cantidad de gradas. La grada más básica le llama infraestructura, el libro. Nosotros generalmente le llamamos obras públicas. Es decir, que los gobiernos se reúnan para hablar de obras públicas, pues es algo relativamente común y yo pienso que es el pan nuestro de cada día. Pero de ahí en adelante la agenda se va haciendo más compleja hasta que llega el cambio climático, las pandemias y el narcotráfico, que son temas francamente poco discutidos en lo que sería la agenda de la CONAGO. Entonces, podríamos hacer énfasis en estas diferencias que acabo yo de señalar y empezar a estudiar con mayor detenimiento los pocos consejos que nos quedan. Uno de ellos es el Consejo Nacional de Autoridades Educativas, que tal vez pase a ser el único consejo vertical mexicano. Y dos consejos que serían horizontales, la Conferencia Nacional de Gobernadores, la CONAGO, y la Conferencia Permanente de Congresos Locales o COPECOL. En el ámbito local existen consejos que también pudieran ser motivo del estudio a través de los indicadores de Schnabel, como yo le he empezado a llamar, ¿sí? Entonces, estos indicadores es el Consejo de Prevención y Crecimiento, de Control del Crecimiento Urbano. El Estado de México tiene este consejo, uno en cada uno de los municipios, ¿sí? Y tiene un trabajo muy importante para la regularización de la tenencia de la tierra y para prevenir los asentamientos humanos irregulares. Y el otro serían los gabinetes regionales. Cada uno de los estados se divide en regiones y la participación del gobernador en cada una de las regiones en contacto con sus presidentes municipales creo que sigue siendo algo de valor. Entonces, pareciera ser que ahora, ante la extinción de los consejos intergubernamentales a nivel nacional, nos veríamos obligados a dar más énfasis al estudio de la relación Estado-municipio para de esa manera poder aplicar los indicadores de Schnabel en el caso nacional mexicano. Son únicamente mis comentarios, agradecer nuevamente la oportunidad, dejar este libro, ¿sí? Y felicitar nuevamente a Johanna.
Gracias, Jorge. So we will listen the reaction from Johanna.
Well, thank you very much, Freie, for these comments. It's always a great pleasure because his comments on my book actually teach me a lot about Mexican federalism. So I very much enjoy the exchange that seems to go both ways, which I think is what we all need, right? We need to learn from each other and then decide what's best for us and our country. So thank you very much for those comments. I will briefly take up what you said about, well, you briefly mentioned Canada actually in your comments, and that reminds me, that will connect to Adi's comments as well, of how important it is to see the overall political and federal system of a country, and which allows me to put intergovernmental councils a little bit in perspective. Of course, we cannot rely only on intergovernmental councils to make federalism work in a country. Intergovernmental councils always operate within the overall federal framework, and it's the interactions of different aspects of the federal system that explain whether whether federalism in a country can deliver on its purpose. Johanna Bettner has shown this very nicely in her book, The Robust Federation, in which she shows how different, she calls them safeguard, different institutions of the political system need to work together, complement each other to make federalism work. And so I'd like to use Canada as one example to illustrate this. When I looked at the Canadian case as well in my book, and what I found is that in Canada, intergovernmental relations are very strongly dominated by the federal government. The federal government has the so-called federal spending power, which is something that's also very pronounced in Mexico, from what I understand. So federal government can interfere in areas of constituent unit jurisdiction by offering money to the constituent units, to the provinces, and in exchange for money, they need to fulfill certain conditions set by the federal government. On top of that, the federal government chairs most vertical councils in Canada. So we could now conclude that Canada is like Mexico. It's a very centralized, top-down federations, but in fact, it's not. And the main reason why it's not is that the provinces have very strong, what's called self-rule, or very strong autonomy. The Canadian provinces are responsible for a very large range of policy areas. They decide on many aspects themselves, and the federal government can offer funding to shape these policies, but the provinces can accept this money or can refuse the money. And although they are to some extent dependent in major areas like healthcare, in many areas they're not, because not only do they have a lot of policy autonomy, they also have a lot of fiscal autonomy. Provinces collect a lot of revenues that obviously gives them powers as well. So there are many situations where the provinces can resist the federal government, which means that the extent to which the federal government can can shape policymaking in the provinces is quite limited. Now, focusing on intergovernmental councils, there's also another mechanism that somewhat limits the power the federal government has over intergovernmental councils. And that's the fact that in Canada, many councils that are vertical, so include the federal government, also exist as a horizontal version. So for instance, there is a Council of Finance Ministers. They call it Federal Provincial Territorial Council of Finance Ministers. That's a federal finance minister and the provincial finance minister. But there's also something that's called a Provincial Territorial Conference of or meeting of finance ministers, and that's just the provinces. What the provinces do quite often is that they meet in this horizontal council without the federal government to build a joint position of all the provinces before negotiating with the federal government. That is sometimes successful, sometimes it's not successful, but overall it gives the provinces more of a leverage than if they just meet with the federal government, and the federal government can have bilateral negotiations with the provinces. So forging common front of the provinces can also help them to make themselves heard. And I'll finish on that. As I said earlier, in Canada, the understanding is that the provinces are a fundamental part of the Canadian Federation. They have their own legitimacy, and the federal government and the provinces meet as more or less equal partners, core aspects of core elements of the Canadian Federation. So that makes a very big difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. We have 15 minutes to use this time to continue the discussion. So I will ask the discussion if you have more questions or comments. Adi, Joel.
Sí, gracias. Pensando en estas recomendaciones que ofrece Johanna, ¿qué características deberían tener estos consejos intergubernamentales para ser de utilidad a un país, a sus regiones? Mi pregunta sería, yo sé que la experiencia europea en general es muy diferente, pero ¿cuál sería, pensando en un contexto de mucha centralización, de una cultura política que está arraigada en esta idea de centralización, cómo comenzar esta transformación de estos consejos intergubernamentales? Porque yo pensaría, por la forma en la que está estructurada formalmente estos consejos, pues en realidad quien decide sobre el diseño de cómo se componen, sus capacidades de toma de decisiones e incluso cómo se financian, pues son de la federación, ¿no? Y es un gobierno federal, no de ahora, sino que de siempre, que ha sido un gobierno federal sumamente centralizado, ¿no? Al menos en el caso de México. En el caso de Brasil, digamos que su nivel de descentralización es mucho más elevado que el nuestro. Entonces, dadas las circunstancias políticas que hay en el país y en casi toda la región, realmente qué posibilidades tenemos de tener en el mediano o largo plazo un cambio en el perfil que tienen actualmente estos consejos intergubernamentales. Me gustaría escuchar tus reflexiones, que ya sé que, ya sé que los contextos son muy distintos, pero ¿cuáles son como tus ideas? ¿Cómo podríamos empezar? Gracias.
That's a very, very good and very relevant question. I'm not sure I have a very good answer, but I have two things that might help intergovernmental councils to promote a better partnership between the two orders of government. And I think one of them, and again, that's coming from a very, let's say, formalized tradition, but one of them is for councils to have a statute or working order, whatever you want to call it. So a document that defines what the council does and, more importantly, how it does that. So these statutes should mention the decision-making rules, should mention the frequency of meetings. There should be regular meetings that occur at least once a year, preferably twice a year, or even more often. And then actually, of course, these meetings also must be held, and that establish committees and so on. And so, of course, those are not laws. They cannot be legally enforced. If a meeting is not held, you cannot go to the court and require the council to be held. And having a meeting, of course, also doesn't really tell you much, because they can have a meeting and not reach agreement, of course. But such documents create a certain expectation that there will be an interaction. And so I think that this can be very, very helpful. They need to be thought through, of course, and they need to be appropriate. They also need to take into consideration that organizing a meeting is not an easy thing to do. It needs to have the administrative support to be organized. Mexico is a big country, so members of government will need to travel unless the meeting is held online. So these are, of course, things that need to be taken into consideration, but having a more formalized format that still, another important issue, provides for enough flexibility to organize meetings ad hoc if need be. So if there's a crisis, for instance, if an emergency, meetings need to occur immediately, even if, let's say, the statute doesn't foresee another meeting until 3 months. So having a formal format while allowing enough flexibility is one thing to strengthen intergovernmental councils. The other thing is something that I observed now working on a paper with 2 colleagues in which we compared the role of intergovernmental councils during the COVID-19 pandemic in Germany and Switzerland, in which one of the indicators we looked at was communication by intergovernmental councils. We can see that in Germany and Switzerland, councils have been more active in communicating their activities to the public. In Canada, this has a long tradition. There's the so-called Intergovernmental Conference Secretariat that publishes meeting communiques after each meeting of a conference. I think this fosters a transparency, of course. It creates some, we can actually see what happened at the meetings, although it's usually summaries, but also creates visibility of these councils. And by communicating what was discussed, what governments decide, of course, they also create an expectation that they will actually follow through on what they decided. So I think this can also be a means of intergovernmental councils to be more active and to, in a way, create a framework for themselves, for their members, that creates some more reliability of intergovernmental cooperation that could help improve the relationships between the 2 orders of government.
Gracias, Johanna. Joel, ¿quieres hacer alguna otra precisión, pregunta?
Sí, pues afortunadamente se está grabando esta sesión. Yo creo que su difusión va a ser principalmente por esa vía. Y yo quiero hacer un comentario que tal vez nunca te lo he hecho notar y tal vez es ajeno al libro, pero a mí me inquieta en mi labor de profesor. La mayor parte de las veces que yo he escrito con alumnos han sido con alumnas, ¿sí? Y yo tengo mucho respeto a mi carrera porque yo la leía cuando yo todavía era funcionario público y tal vez esas lecturas que yo hacía de lo que Adi escribía, pues fueron mi inspiración para después cambiar de carrera a lo que sería la investigación y la docencia. Tú eres una mujer que podría ser un ejemplo para las alumnas en México, porque tal vez aquí en México el tema de federalismo y el tema de relaciones intergubernamentales es más para hombres, pero tú eres una feminista discreta que defiende a sus amigas, hablas de Jenna Bednar, que es mujer, hablas de Nicole Bolleyer, que es mujer, y hablas de Yvonne Hegele, que también es mujer. O sea, pareciera que hay una especie de solidaridad, se llama sororidad, es la palabra en español, es decir, una solidaridad femenina más o menos fuerte. Entonces, si tú tuvieras que mandarle un mensaje a mis alumnos, alumnas preferentemente, ¿qué les dirías en relación al estudio preferente de las mujeres ahora sobre la materia del
Yeah, that's a very important point, of course. And it's, I remember I attended a conference when I was very early in my PhD. And at some point the discussion was about gender equality. And someone asked me how it was to be the only woman in a room of federalism scholars. And turned out actually that everybody who was sitting at this meeting was, well, all of them were men. And so that used to be the case many years ago. Now, fortunately, in many countries, there are more women studying federalism, which I think is a very, very good thing. And so I think what's really helpful in this regard is to support each other, right? And to make sure that women are visible and that we read women's texts that are published on that topic. And I think in a way the my conclusion on intergovernmental councils applies to this setting as well. It's important to develop a partnership between federalism scholars, whether they're female or male, and give each other acknowledgement and recognition for the work we do. And I can say all those names that Raul just mentioned are very great female scholars working on federalism. I'm very pleased that they're doing this work and that I get to work with them. So I can only encourage all women to study federalism and to get out there.
Gracias.
Gracias, Johanna. Yo, bueno, antes hacia la conclusión de esta presentación, quisiera abusar de mi rol y hacer un comentario y una pregunta. Bueno, el comentario es que me dio un poco de no desolación, pero quizá un golpe de realismo al ver esas 5 recomendaciones y hacer un checklist si son observadas ya en nuestras dinámicas intergubernamentales o no. Y yo creo que si en la quinta podríamos pensar que sí se establecen en diversos campos o áreas o sectores, se han establecido figuras que podemos asemejar a consejos intergubernamentales. Yo creo que las primeras 4 sugerencias, pues no, difícilmente vamos a encontrar que en los últimos muchos años, no es algo muy reciente, que no sucede, ¿no? Ya Joel Mendoza mencionaba algunos ejemplos de lo que podemos considerar consejos, y si bien en la CONAGUA hay una rotación, hay una horizontalidad, en general los otros 4 puntos creo que no los observamos acá. Entonces no quería dejar de comentarle a Johanna lo interesante, lo provocadora que puede ser su última observación, su última sugerencia y pregunta, la última lámina que nos presentó, y agradecérselo. Y yo quisiera volver a una pregunta que, perdón, es retomar un punto que fue rápidamente mencionado en alguna de las respuestas, y es con respecto a, bueno, esta obra fue escrita antes de la irrupción de la pandemia, y la pandemia, de alguna forma, cuando hemos discutido en los seminarios estos temas, la pandemia cristalizó o hizo que aparecieran de manera más nítida, más clara, esas pues inclinaciones, amenazas a los frágiles equilibrios federales. De pronto apareció la necesidad de que, si es necesario, poner freno a las autonomías de los estados, y los gobiernos nacionales estuvieron obligados a, como en los tiempos de las guerras, a actuar un poco pues con más autoridad, e incluso pasando por encima de las autonomías de los estados. Entonces yo he leído algunos trabajos posteriores a la pandemia de Johanna. Quisiera pedirle así muy rápidamente su impresión sobre la manera como la pandemia cristalizó o puso en evidencia cambios en las relaciones entre los niveles de gobierno, en la naturaleza de los consejos que ya había observado Johanna, y si piensa que ahora que estamos en un momento posterior a la pandemia, esas dinámicas o mecanismos intergubernamentales están volviendo a como operaban antes de la pandemia, o hay algo que se queda en esa centralización, en esa adquisición de mayor poder de los gobiernos nacionales.
Thank you very much for this, the comment and the question. If I can comment on your comment, I think one important thing to keep in mind is that, of course, I think I said that earlier, there's no automatism that by establishing an intergovernmental council, giving it a statute and everything will be well. Of course, intergovernmental councils are venues that allow governments to cooperate if governments want to cooperate. So very much depends on political will, of course. And I think that's also very important on political leadership. If political leaders are able to be good political leaders, they might be able and willing to work together. If they're not, cooperation is, of course, much more difficult to achieve. So I think this is a very valid point. And I certainly don't want to raise any expectations that I have a recipe, you apply this to a country and things will be perfect. Of course, politics are more complex. Now, regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, it's probably a bit more difficult for me to answer that question because you mentioned centralization. And I think, but I'm not entirely sure, that there has been quite some centralization in Latin American countries, and there might be countries where federal governments have used the opportunity to centralize power. Now, in the countries that I know best, actually the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the importance of the constituent units. We can see this in Australia, in Canada, and even in Germany, although Germany is a fairly centralized, much less centralized country than Mexico, but much more centralized than Australia and Canada, for instance. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Länder played a key role. They made most of the decisions about lockdowns, about the closure of restaurants, about the closure of schools, public health measures, and so on, in coordination with each other and with the federal government. But they were key actors. The Australian states were key actors. In Canada, the provinces took action. So I don't even see much of this centralization that you describe, although we can see temporary, and I'm not sure I would actually call it centralization, but it temporary highlighted importance of federal and central governments in some countries. But this was most of the time in the countries that I know was temporary. So it would be very interesting to see whether in Latin American countries, for instance, the centralization persisted after the pandemic, but I'm in no position to say anything on that. What I'm in a position to say something about is the importance of cooperation, because COVID-19 not only highlighted the importance of constituent units in many countries, but what emerged as a key fact, and we can see that in a lot of studies that looked at factors explaining successful management of the pandemic, and all those studies highlight the importance of cooperation. Whatever the system, both orders of government are involved in one way or another in crisis management. And it's by cooperating, by coordinating, that they could successfully manage the pandemic. Now, one challenge, of course, that emerges here is that cooperation takes time. And so countries, so multi-level countries where the two orders of government had to work together might have been slower to react to the pandemic than countries where this was not the case, where we have one strong central government that can make decisions. In some way, we can see a difference here between France and Germany, for instance. In Germany, the Länder and the federal government had to meet, had discussed anything. It took them some time to take action. The French government sometimes was much quicker because it did not have to work together with, and not to the same extent with the départements and regions in France. So I think that's a key challenge, a key lesson to take away from the pandemic, is to think about ways to improve cooperation, and those are discussions that are going on now in many countries. Of course, now sidelined by new crises that have emerged, but even with those crises, we can see that cooperation is very important. So the challenge will be for future crises, for future pandemics, to ensure that cooperation happens quickly and in a reliable manner. I hope that answers your question.
Y muchas gracias, muchas gracias. Pues, bueno, no nos queda más que con esta última reflexión sobre la necesidad de la cooperación, sobre también implícitamente la prevalencia de las interdependencias, que es además el inicio de este libro que nos reúne hoy, la existencia de las interdependencias entre niveles de gobierno en muchos ámbitos. Y entonces la cooperación necesaria para que los asuntos y las soluciones, perdón, para que las soluciones se encuentren a los problemas que se vienen planteando, que esas ideas. Cerramos esta discusión. Yo quiero invitar a quienes nos siguen, a quienes nos siguieron en la transmisión, los quiero invitar a la lectura de este libro, a la lectura de otros trabajos de Johanna Schnabel sobre estos mismos temas, y agradecerle a Johanna su participación, el haber aceptado hacer comentarios sobre su libro, y también desde luego a Adi Carrera y a Joel Mendoza que estuvieron en el Colegio de México para discutir el libro. Muchas gracias. Les transmito también los saludos de José Eduardo Green, que ya mencionaba. Joel es coautor en el introductorio. Y pues esta discusión estará en el canal de YouTube del Colegio de México, en donde podrán verla en cualquier momento. Muchas gracias.
Saludos, Johanna.
Thank you very much.
Good evening.